Hello everyone. In this video we're going to be talking about qualitative methods of research. So up until this point we've talked about quantitative methods. Now we're going to turn our attention to a different kind of research that can be used in organizations. So we'll talk about some qualitative methods and we'll talk about some qualitative analysis tied to the readings that you had for this module as well. So let's first talk about the overall picture of research. Now, if you look on the right-hand side of this chart, you'll see that we've already talked about many of these kinds of research in quantitative inquiry. So we've talked about regression analysis, we've talked about using descriptive statistics, correlations, we've talked about experimental design, ANOVA and t-test. There are many more types of quantitative tests and statistical tests that we can use when doing research. What we haven't spent much time on is the left-hand side of this chart, which is qualitative inquiry. So we're going to talk about 5 specific kinds of qualitative methods in this module today. Now keep in mind that qualitative and quantitative research, qualitative and quantitative data, both comprise what we think of as empirical research. Empirical research simply meaning that our data is based on observation, that we can directly observe something. So I want you to not think about qualitative research or qualitative data as something completely different from quantitative research, quantitative data, where both kinds of research are essentially trying to do the same thing, and that's to understand people and situations better. So we'll talk about those 5 kinds of qualitative methods in this module. So what is qualitative data? Well, it deals with meanings and meaning making, and that's something that quantitative data can't do very well. When we talk about doing this, we talk about meaning making, we think that, or we propose or suppose that qualitative data does this primarily through language and action. So this will come into play when we think about things like observations, interviews, and document analysis. So we're trying to get meaning, we're trying to take meaning away from something that we can, that someone can explain to us through their words or language, or that we see them do, okay? The goal is to capture, understand, and represent participants' perceptions and meanings through and in their own words, to understand the experience and essence of the context. So again, we're thinking about trying to understand a situation, understand a person, understand a concept more deeply than we would with, say, quantitative data. One of the hallmarks of qualitative data, qualitative research, is that it's rich, thick descriptions rather than numbers. So rather than saying, 35% of employees think this, we would say, here's a certain amount of employees who think this thing, and here are some quotes that exemplify that, or here are some pictures that exemplify that, things like that. Sometimes this process is recursive. So whereas quantitative data is pretty straightforward, right? You have a data set. So for example, you send out a survey, you capture your data, you clean it up, you analyze it, you answer your research questions, and you come up with your findings and you move on, right? Qualitative data can be much more recursive, and that means that we often go back. So it's a cyclical process. So instead of saying, here's the data that we came up with, let's answer these questions, we might gather our data and then go back and say, well, are we asking the right question here? And do we need to modify from the start? And so it's this recursive process, this cyclical process that can sort of take us from beginning to end and beginning again as we sort of work through this process, because we learn new things and we understand things from a different perspective. So let's talk about 5 specific kinds of qualitative methodology that we can use in organizations. The first one is the interview. Interviews can be structured, unstructured, or semi-structured. So what's the difference? How do we know which one to use if we're working in an organization? Well, I like to use this example when we're talking about interviews, just to kind of get a sense of what qualitative data is like. I'm willing to bet that almost 100% of you watching this video right now have been a part of an interview before, been part of a qualitative data gathering process, and that's the job interview, right? You've either been the interviewee, right? You have been interviewed for a job, or you have interviewed someone for a job. You've been the hiring manager, right? So you've been involved in an interview process. Now, It's not exactly the same kind of process that we would use to gather data for research. However, if you think about it, the job interview process is gathering information, right? It's gathering data. And what kind of data are you gathering from someone? Well, you're gathering not only the information that they're telling you, right? So how would you respond to certain situations? How would you how do you define leadership? What's your management style? Things like that. You could also gather that through a written format. That's certainly acceptable. But you're gathering other points of data as well. You're gathering the way people respond and how they respond, and their demeanor and their tone and their body language and that sort of thing, right? So you're gathering data. You're gathering information. Typically, job interviews will follow a structured or a semi-structured process. A structured process simply means that you have questions that you do not deviate from. A semi-structured process means that you have questions, but you can certainly deviate from them, whereas an unstructured process means you really don't have questions. Maybe you have some overall guiding questions, but you're really just, you're going to let the conversation flow naturally. So you've been a part of interviews before. We can also use interviews to gather really good, rich, qualitative research data from employees, from others in our organization to solve problems. The next kind of process that I want to talk about is the focus group, and it's very likely that many of you have been part of a focus group in the past. Essentially, a focus group is almost like an interview, but you're using multiple participants. So you are kind of talking to a few people at once. Now, you can use it in combination with other strategies, of course. In fact, most of these processes can be used in combination with other strategies. Some things you want to think about when doing a focus group. You want to think about the makeup of the group, and this is going to be important and tied to your research questions. Are you interested in part-time employees, full-time employees? Are you interested in minority employees? Are you interested in female employees? Who are you interested in talking to? What's the question you're trying to answer? That should help drive the makeup of your group. Consider the stimuli. So by stimuli, what I mean is, what is it that's going to get people talking? I don't mean things like coffee and refreshments and stuff like that, or icebreakers. That's fine. That's all good stuff. But stimuli really is what is going to get people talking about the issue that you have at hand. So for example, let's say that you wanted to do a focus group on the new hiring process that your company is about to roll out. New software, new hiring process that you're going to do. The stimuli may be a process map, right? So that's going to get people talking about what this new process will look like. It could be a case, right? You might say, let's take a look at this case and let's talk about how this works and how it doesn't work. That could be a stimulus to get people talking. In marketing research, oftentimes companies will do research about a specific product. Well, that product becomes the stimulus, right? You're talking about that specific thing. The ideal group size is between 6 and 12, but normally it's around 8 or 9 people. The reason you don't want to have too many people is that you'll have people that dominate the conversation that can easily lead to people that fade into the background and you don't really hear much from them. On the other hand, if you have too few people, you're not getting the diversity of thought and diversity of people speaking up that you really would want. So about 8 or 9 folks is about right. And the duration should be between 1 and 2 hours. Again, too little time and you're not getting the depth of information you want, too much time and people get fatigued. So these are just some pointers, some guidelines. They're not very strict in the sense that, if you went 2.5 hours, you're violating some research protocol, but these are just good guidelines, good rules of thumb to use. Let's talk about the next kind of qualitative inquiry, and that's document analysis. Now, this is a bit different than what many of you have seen before. It's likely that we've been exposed to interviews before, that we've been exposed to focus groups before. We kind of get that. That's pretty easy to get. Document analysis is a little bit different. What we're essentially doing is we're using different written sources to understand an issue. Now, think about what you've been doing for this class. You've been looking at literature and you've been trying to synthesize that literature and tell me what the themes are. It's a similar process, but it's much, much different. What you have to think about is your research aim. So what are you really trying to answer? What documents will you analyze, and how are you going to analyze them? This process can be really complicated if you make it complicated. So what are some documents that, if you analyze them, would tell you something really interesting about an organization? Well, you might think about strategic plans. You might think about meeting minutes. You might think about memos. You might think about websites. There's all kinds of documents that organizations produce that, if you were to analyze them, would tell you something really important about that organization. However, you have to have some specific aim or research question in mind. For example, if you went to an organization's strategic plan and said, I'm going to analyze it for themes, you're going to be lost because you don't have a focus. If, however, you said, I'm going to look at an organization's strategic plan and analyze it for the organization's focus on diversity or lack of focus on diversity, then you have a focus. Then you have an aim, right? You can look for hints of diversity sprinkled throughout that strategic plan, or lack of diversity that does not exist in that plan, right? So you have to have that specific aim. Again, you're looking at documents, you're looking at written sources to try to understand an organization better. These could be, again, policy documents, they could be doctrine, if you work in the military, things like that. But you can analyze those things and come up with findings and themes that reflect that organization. Essentially what you're doing is you're looking at how this organization is reflected in its written documentation. Another type of research that we'll talk about is the case study. Now, this is different than the case study that we've used in class. So it's not a teaching case study. That's called the Harvard Case Study Teaching Method. Instead, a research case study is focused on one particular unit. So that's why I put this picture of this tree on this screen, is that you were focused on this one thing, this one unit. That could be an organization, it could be a team, one individual, one group, one nation, right? So it's not about one individual necessarily, but it's about that one specific unit of observation. And what we do in a case study is we try to use various methods to describe and understand that unit. So for example, if I wanted to do a case study on your work team, what I might do is interviews with each individual in that team, as well as observations of that team, as well as document analysis of the meeting minutes that you all kept as a team, right? So I'm using various methods to sort of pinpoint or examine this idea of this one unit, this one case, this one team of analysis. And so I'm going to focus my efforts on understanding that one specific unit. Again, this could be one individual, but it could also just be one team or one organization. So the whole point of a case study is it's focused on one specific unit. That's the boundaries of a case study. The last one that we'll talk about is observations. And again, many of you may have been familiar with observations either through job observations for evaluation purposes, maybe some marketing research, things like that. So you might have been exposed to observations before, but essentially what we're trying to do with observations is we're attempting to observe a phenomenon or an individual in its, quote, natural setting. So I use that in quotes because natural setting is sort of interpreted by the research question that you have. So for example, if we're interested in looking at employees, we would want to observe them in their work environment, right? We'd want to observe them in their team dynamics or in meetings and things like that. That's the, quote, natural environment that we're looking for. We can take on different roles as the researcher. We could be covert, which means that we remain unidentified. So we're going to be secretly observing folks as they go about their business throughout the day. We could be overt in that we identify ourselves and say, hey, I'm here to observe, and don't mind me, I'll be sitting in the back of the room and just watch how things unfold. Or there's a type of observation called participatory observation, where you actually take an active role while observing. So there's three kinds of observations that you can choose. Now, there are strengths and limitations of each, obviously. So if you do a covert observation, you get truer data, not exactly true data, but you get truer data. So if you said, I'm going to be a secret shopper, for example, you get a little bit truer data than you would if you said, hey, I'm here to observe, I'm here to critique. However, there are ethical concerns with doing that. So if your employees found out that you were secretly observing them doing their jobs, what would they think about that? How would you respond to that as an individual? It's not always a bad thing necessarily, but it's just something to keep in mind. And then, of course, participatory observation means that you are actively engaged not only in that process, but potentially even changing the situation. So you have to be aware of that as well. There's not necessarily, of these three, there's not necessarily one best or one worst method. It's just really dependent on what questions you're trying to answer. With qualitative data, you end up with a data set that's different than quantitative data. So with quantitative data, you end up with numbers and variables, right? You've been exposed to that. You're working with quantitative data right now. But in a qualitative process, you end up with maybe audio recordings, video recordings, transcripts, and other kinds of data that can't just be analyzed right away. You have to do something for it first. With quantitative data, you just crunch the numbers, right? You can do a correlation analysis, you can find some averages, things like that. But what do you do with qualitative data? Well, you have to follow a similar process. However, it's going to be somewhat different than quantitative data. Now, according to the readings you had this week, they use a process. I'll talk about this highlighted here as well. So, of course, you have to prepare the data. You have to get it in an accessible format. That might be putting things into a Word document. It could be putting them into PDFs. It could be somehow filing this information so that you can easily access the information. The next thing you have to do is you have to familiarize yourself with the data. That means you should re-examine your notes. You should watch videos again of say the focus group that you did. You should read your transcripts. You should take copious notes. You should really reflect on what it is that's being brought up in these focus groups or in these interviews, or maybe it's a document analysis. You need to reread all of these things. You then start this process of coding and categorizing. Now, coding is something I'll explain in a little bit more detail in just a moment. You code and categorize, you identify those patterns, and then you interpret those patterns, and you try to make meaning of what these patterns are telling you. So coding is one of the most widely used ways to analyze qualitative data. There are others, but coding is typically the most widely used way to analyze qualitative data. As you're wading through the data you have, you begin to sense those themes. You begin to sense what's happening with the data. Maybe there are similarities that you start to see. Maybe there are contradictions that you start to see. Maybe there are both. You can get codes in two ways. So when I say codes, I mean keywords, codes, phrases, things that you really want to highlight. A priori coding means that you get those codes, you get those keywords from previous research or theory. Emergent coding means that you let the data in front of you guide you into what codes you should use, what keywords you should use. So here's an example. As I mentioned in class before, I study what's called organizational citizenship behavior. So let's say I did a bunch of interviews with people in your organization, and I wanted to understand how they enacted organizational citizenship behavior. Well, theory tells me that there are 5 dimensions to organizational citizenship behavior. There's altruism, sportsmanship, civic virtue, conscientiousness, and courtesy. I could look for those 5 things in the interviews that I found if I were using an a priori coding process. So I could look for those 5 specific things. If, on the other hand, I used an emergent process, I wouldn't look for those 5 codes. I would simply look for whatever the data told me, right? So if people started talking about helping behaviors a lot, and then they started talking about voluntary behaviors, then I would use those as the codes that sort of emerged, right? So I'm sort of going into, in an emergent process, I'm going into the data a little bit blindly, and I'm sort of letting the data guide me as I go. So in sum, qualitative research uses different methodologies resulting in different kinds of data. It doesn't mean that it's bad. It doesn't mean that it's better. It means that it's different. So qualitative data, qualitative research is just as rigorous, just as robust as quantitative. It's just that typically organizations rely a bit more on quantitative data than qualitative. Qualitative data, qualitative research takes time, it's intensive, and it's a very thorough process. Qualitative inquiry is about richness. Remember those keywords, rich and thick. Those are the descriptions that we're going after. We're not going after, hey, 60% of people said this, period. We're going after, what do people really think about this? How do they really make meaning of this? But in the end, picking a methodology should always be a product of what you want to know. You should always let your research questions, your aims, guide you in choosing qualitative or quantitative.